I want to introduce you to my concept of time and timelessness. But before I do, this is a list of some recommended research topics. I highly recommend Minute Physics on YouTube. And if you watch some of their videos on these, it'll give you some extra scientific context about some of the ideas that I'm presenting. I obviously present them in a more metaphorical, spiritual way, but everything that I'm saying at least is intended to be in line with what I understand or what I believe I understand about science. So this is, you could say, another way to look at the things that I'm trying to describe, which is a more scientific way of looking at it, as compared to my more spiritual, artistic, intuitive way of looking at things. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, how I define time is the subjective product of internally and externally observed change. So what that essentially means is that if there is no observed change, then there is no time, which would put us in a state of timelessness. So similar to the state of nothingness, timelessness is still a state, right? So if we go back to the concept of like water, solid, or liquid, solid, and gas, just because it's a different state doesn't mean it is a meaningless state. All of the states have value, but they operate and function differently relative to themselves and other states, okay? And so what I'm essentially trying to say is that when we have observed change, time exists. When there's no observed change, timelessness exists. And both of these are experiences, right? They're subjective experiences of reality and of ourselves, internally and externally. So I'm going to use two primary analogies to try to illustrate what I mean by this. And this breaks it down into the two sort of core examples of time and timelessness, which are intra-world and interworld. And intra is basically just a way of saying within one whole, and inter is basically saying between two wholes, okay? So let's start with the intra-world analogy. And for this, I've got a racetrack. This is a racetrack, and these are two runners, the blue runner and the yellow runner, okay? And in this example, runner A moves infinitely fast, and runner B moves at 8 miles per hour or about 12 kilometers per hour, okay? So this analogy is similar to the flip book or chess analogies that I've used in previous videos. Now, to make my point, if runner A moves infinitely fast and runner B does not move infinitely fast, then from the perspective of runner A, runner B is not moving, okay? And from the perspective of runner B, runner A is not moving because there's no way for them to measure each other's change due to the fact that an infinitely fast speed or velocity, an infinitely fast amount of change, cannot incorporate or be incorporated by a finite amount of change, okay? So in other words, how this would look is if you were runner A, you'd be running around this track infinitely fast, and runner B would never have moved, because in order for runner B to have moved, they would have to essentially get a turn, right? But because you're taking an infinite number of turns, they never get a turn to move. There's no point at which their speed catches up to your speed in terms of being interpreted as a change. So let's use a different example. So if runner A was moving at 800 miles per hour and runner B was moving at 8, then from each other's perspective, from runner A's perspective, runner B would be moving very, very slow, but they would still be moving, right? It would just be like slow motion, like very slow motion. From runner B's perspective, runner A would be moving super, super fast, but they would still be able to measure it. They would still be able to perceive that runner A is moving. But once you make it infinitely fast, okay, runner B can no longer measure runner A's speed, and runner A is no longer measuring runner B's speed because of the fact that they're moving infinitely faster than them. So to the perspective of each other, neither one of them would appear to be moving. So you can think of it as runner A is in something of a superposition. And what I mean by that is if you were to try to measure runner A's position, they're always perpetually at every possible position because they're moving infinitely fast, which means that there's no point in attempting to measure them when they are not at all positions. So the only measurement you have is in the beginning before they started moving, where they were standing right next to you, right? Beyond that, they are literally everywhere, and therefore, as we've talked about in the past, everything and nothing are the same thing. So because they are everywhere, they appear to be nowhere to you. All right. Now, however, if they were to change something, so the reason that that's the case is because there's no way for you to measure change, right? There's no way for you to observe change externally to yourself. However, if they were to, say, for example, draw or paint a smiley face, right? Let's say they painted a smiley face on the track in front of you as they were moving infinitely fast. You still would not see them, but you would be able to see the smiley face that they painted, right? Because if you think of it like a flip book, in frame A, there's no smiley face. In frame B, suddenly there's a smiley face, right? So we're able to measure or observe the external change from frame A to frame B. And from that, we can recognize that something has occurred within time, which is to say that the smiley face appeared. And something must have caused that smiley face to appear, because anytime time exists, cause and effect also exists, right? Because change has a chain, a cause and effect chain of that change, which allows us to interpret time, allows us to interpret cause and effect. So you wouldn't be able to see runner A, but you would be able to see the consequences of their action, namely the smiley face. Okay? So intra-world, within the same world, you can see, or any change that you can measure that is a part of your world that is interacting with you will appear to be existing within time, but anything that you cannot measure as change will appear to be existing outside of time. Even if it is indeed changing, the only thing that matters is your experience of time. Okay, this is special relativity essentially. The only thing that really matters is your experience of time, and you will not be able to update that experience until you are able to measure change from your point of view. So time only exists relative to your point of view and your ability to measure change. That's not to say that nothing is changing just because you're not measuring it, right? Things could be changing, time could be existing, but it doesn't exist for you, it doesn't exist internally until you're able to measure it through change. That's how you experience time. Okay, so let's talk about interworld time and timelessness. So interworld, again, means the concept of between two different worlds. And so when I'm talking about worlds, what I'm basically talking about is if we think of like a web, right? So let's say that this original dot is the state of nothingness, right? It's the mind in the state of nothingness that all other worlds emerge from. Well, you can think of this kind of like the multiple worlds interpretation of quantum physics, right? Where this one world kind of connects to and spits off a web of other worlds, and all of these worlds are variations of this world. And this comes back to the fundamental equation, right? Where this is the non-dual world, and these are all the dual worlds, which have some variation other than zero, right? Some variation that includes separation of the whole. So in these worlds, time exists, and in this world, it would be timelessness that exists. And I say timelessness that exists because even though I may also say time doesn't exist, what I really mean to say is that it's a state of timelessness that does exist, because as long as there's an observer, something exists, right? Even if that something that exists is a state of nothingness. I know that's difficult for a lot of people to comprehend, but that's the best I can do for now while keeping this video as short as possible. So basically this interworld concept is the interaction between dualistic worlds. Okay, so we're not talking about the interaction between dual and non-dual worlds. We're talking about the interaction between two different dualistic worlds. All right, and so I'm going to use the analogy of books to explain how normally those worlds don't directly interact, but they can both be observed by the same observer. So let's think about two different books. One is the story of Remy, and the other is the story of Yara, okay? And when we have the story of Remy open, our time is progressing as we read the changes, as we observe the changes of that book, right? So as we're reading the words in the book, we're perceiving the change within that storyline. So time is moving forward in the book based on our perception of change within the book. Does that make sense? So if we stop reading and we close the book of Remy, time stops moving within that story, right? Because when you open the book back up, you're going to come back to the same part where you left off, even though time has moved in your world, right? So here's you, the reader, all right? I'm not even going to draw the glass. That's too stereotypical. So here's you, the reader, and your timeline is always moving for you, right? Because you're observing changes internally to yourself and externally to yourself in your world. And then there's as the observer, and then there's the story of Remy. So when you, the observer, are observing the story of Remy, its timeline is moving forward as you read it. But if you close the book, relative to your timeline, this timeline is no longer moving. Okay, so it's similar to you're moving infinitely fast. Think of it that way. You're moving infinitely fast, and so this is standing still. The timeline in this book is standing still. And that may be a weird way to conceptualize it, but I think that it's accurate. That in essence, because you are moving, but it is not, it is the same thing as saying you are moving infinitely fast and it is moving infinitely slow, right? Movement, one movement versus zero movement is essentially the same as infinite. 1 to 0 is infinite, right? So basically, if I were to then, or you were to then open the book of Yara, so this is a different world, right? Because the story of Yara doesn't necessarily take place in the same world as the story of Remy. So just because I'm reading about Yara doesn't mean that Remy is now moving forward, right? So as long as this book is closed, the story of Remy is closed, the time there is not moving forward. So now we're looking at the story of Yara, okay? When we're reading the story of Yara, the timeline is moving forward. And then when we close the story of Yara and reopen the story of Remy, the timeline here is moving forward. Okay? So technically speaking, if you're looking at it from the perspective of Remy or Yara, okay, from Remy's perspective, the timeline in his book never stops moving forward, right? Remy, from that character's point of view, is always experiencing a normal rate of time. Because from Remy's perspective in the book, he's always experiencing things as they change, right? But you, when reading Remy's book, only experience his time moving forward, or her time moving forward, Remy's a neutral name, when you experience Remy's change, when you observe Remy's change, right? So think about staring at the open book. If you don't read the next word, is Remy's timeline moving forward for you? No. So it doesn't matter whether or not you're looking at the world. It matters whether or not frame A and frame B are different, okay? If frame A is on the word the, and frame B is also on the word the same exact the within the book. I'm not talking about a book, or I'm not talking about the later on in the book or the earlier in the book. I'm talking about the exact same word the at the exact same point in the book, right? If frame A and frame B, meaning that you're just staring at the word, are the same, then time has not moved forward for Remy, even though time is moving forward for you, right? Because time is relative. So it's the same thing between Remy and Yara, right? Where Remy can be experiencing Remy's timeline, and Yara's timeline is not moving for Remy because Remy is not observing any change within Yara's timeline. So as the observer, if we're reading Remy's timeline, but we're not reading Yara's timeline, then Remy's timeline is moving forward and Yara's timeline is standing still. So you can see how time is very relative, and just because time is moving within one world does not necessarily mean it's moving within another world. And just because it's moving for each world doesn't mean that it has to, or just because it's moving in one world doesn't necessarily mean it has to be standing still with another world. So like I said, because Yara's timeline is standing still for you, Yara only experiences Yara when you're reading Yara, right? Because Yara is the character in your mind. So Yara only experiences their world moving forward. Like if you think of reading Yara's thoughts in the book, right? That's reading the character of Yara. That's reading their internal experience. Their internal experience is external to you. This is so complicated. I'm so sorry. But because because you are observing their internal experience, that is their timeline. So you're perceiving their timeline from their point of view, even though you're reading it from your point of view. God, I know that's so overcomplicated, but hopefully it makes sense to you. So basically, if we think about the speed of light, the speed of light is the sort of maximum speed that anything in our world can go, right? So anything moving outside the speed of light, which is c, the speed of light is represented as c. So anything moving faster than the speed of light can be thought of as reading or existing outside of the change within our story. Okay, whoops. So anything that can move when we are not moving would be moving faster than the speed of light. Okay, so this is how time becomes relative even within physics. And I don't want to get too much into the science here because, again, I'm not trying to be a scientist. I'm not trying to make scientific claims necessarily, although I do think that the things I'm saying, which parts can be tested scientifically, will be true scientifically. So I'm not backing down and saying that I don't have to be scientifically accurate even when I am. Why is that erasing that? I don't understand. But anyways, so I believe what I'm saying is true scientifically, but I'm not trying to make a scientific case right now. So if we think of the movement of light, right? Light is the fastest anything can move. And so when something moves faster than light, it does not appear to be moving to us from our perspective. And from its perspective, we do not appear to be moving. So in a spiritual, sort of metaphorical, abstract way, it could be interpreted literally, but I'm interpreting it and trying to teach it abstractly. In an abstract way, that is the same thing as closing and opening a book or reading or not reading the book, right? So from the character's perspective within the book, their world is always moving because they're only having an experience when the story is moving forward, right? Remy, the character Remy, doesn't have an experience when the book is not being read. So even though to Remy, from Remy's point of view, Remy only exists when the book is being read, right? So let's put it this way. So when you are reading the book, Remy's timeline is moving forward, right? When you stop reading, Remy's timeline stops moving forward. So Remy freezes in this frame, right? So it would be like representing it this way. It would be like saying in frame, let's use some real squares. Sorry, they're not the same size. I am genuinely kind of lazy. Okay, so frame A, B, C, D, D, D. Okay, so when we look at these frames, the content of the frame either represents a change or it doesn't, right? So the content of the frame in this is A, and in this it's B. So that would be like saying we're reading a different word, right? So Remy's timeline is moving forward because we're reading something different. So to Remy, Remy's experiencing something different because we've read that Remy's experiencing something different. But when we are still experiencing our own life, right? Like when the book is closed and on a shelf, that's like saying to Remy, it's D, 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 right? So from our frame, things are changing. But from Remy's frame, it's the same frame repeating over and over again. So that's how you can have two different worlds that are experiencing two different timelines, right? So from our point of view, there's a different frame, right? Because our mind is looking at this differently than Remy's mind is. Because Remy's mind only exists when we are interpreting it as a character within a book. So in other words, and just to clarify, I'm not necessarily saying that when you read a character in a book that the character is real. I'm using this as an analogy, okay? But basically, the point that I'm making is if in your reality this is D, E, F, right, then your timeline is still moving forward. Like, let's say you go to the fridge and get a snack after you put your book down, right, or you go hang out with your friends, then your timeline is still moving forward because you're still experiencing change. But because Remy is stuck in the book, Remy's not experiencing change, right? Until you read the next word, Remy's stuck on the same frame, okay? But Remy is not inside the book thinking, oh no, I'm frozen in time, because that would be an internally observed change. So that would be a different frame for Remy internally. So Remy's not having an internal change. Remy's not observing an internal change, which means that Remy is in a timeless state. Remy's internal and external state is D, right? It's the same. It's the same frame. There's no change internally or externally for Remy until you pick the book back up and start reading it again. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do to demonstrate that Remy's world does not necessarily have the same time as your world. It can, when you're reading the book, line up and interact. But when your worlds are not interacting, they do not have the same timeline. Okay? So this represents how, for example, one mind can interact with all of these different realities, right? So if we think of our one mind, I've stated before that we are all one mind. There is only one mind, and everything is mind. So all that exists is mind, the one single observer. Okay? So how can that one single observer go experience this universe as Remy, then go experience this universe as Yara, without them causing a problem for each other where, wait, how can you be observing this and this at the same time? That's the point. It's not the same time. They're different times because the only thing that matters is what is changing relative to the point of view. So if this observer goes into the point of view of Remy, then when it is in the point of view of Remy, right? So Remy is like an object in this world. When it is in the point of view of Remy, Remy's timeline is moving forward. But if it exits the point of view of Remy, then Remy stands still while it's over here, right? Experiencing the point of view of Yara until it stops experiencing the point of view of Yara. Then Yara's point of view stands still. Then it can go to a third world and experience somebody else's point of view, right? Naomi, whatever. Nigel. So when you understand that this all comes back to the concept of identity, right? And how the ego or the self is more like a cup that shapes the water coming into it, right? So if the observer is kind of like, it's not that the observer itself is water, it's the experience that the observer is experiencing is shaped by the container that it's in. And the container is a self or an ego. When I say container, I both mean a physical object, but not necessarily a physical object. I'm talking about an abstract conceptual object, right? Just like in a dream, your dream character, is that a physical object or not? Well, in a sense it is, right? Because when you're in the dream, you're experiencing your dream as a physical body, right? When you're inside the dream, your body feels like a physical body, and everything you touch in the dream feels like a physical object because it is subjectively interpreted as an object, right? Because you're subjectively interpreting it through your dream character, which is your avatar, right? Which is the same thing as yourself or ego, which is the same thing as the cup, right? So when you are reading the book of Remy, you're interpreting Remy's experience through the lens, through the point of view of Remy as the reader, okay? So you kind of transport yourself into the shoes of Remy, and you're experiencing the book as the character Remy, even though you yourself are not technically Remy. You are observing Remy internally, right? Like when you read Remy's thoughts, you're essentially experiencing what it's like to be Remy from Remy's point of view. But you're doing that externally, right? You're doing that as something else. So if we go back to the fundamental equation and we talk about dual versus non-dual, all of us, are technically a non-dualistic, self-observing mind, an observer, that is experiencing an infinite number of dualistic perspectives that are relative to each other and also relative to the observer itself or ourself. Okay? So hopefully that gives you some idea of what I mean by the idea that time is a subjective project, or time is the subjective product of internally or externally observed change, and how time and timelessness can coexist, right? You can experience multiple times at the same time without them having to move simultaneously, right? The concept of simultaneity, the concept of simultaneous, is relative because it's based on change, what is and isn't changing, and what the observer is or isn't observing. So we're able to, as God, as the one consciousness, as the one source, the one soul, whatever you want to call it, we are able to have these, what we can explain as many dreams, right? Or read these many stories of an infinite number of characters, an infinite number of points of view, without having to have a paradox or a conflict between the fact that you and I, right now, exist within the same world, right? So it's kind of like saying we're two different characters within the story of Remy. And since when we're reading the character Remy's story, Remy and all the characters in Remy's story are all moving forward at the same time. So it begs the question, it makes us wonder, well, how then can I be Remy and also another character in Remy's story we'll call, Pasha, right? So when Remy's story is moving forward, Pasha's story is moving forward because they're in the same story, right? So whenever I'm reading Remy's story, Remy's world is active. And because it's active, that means it's changing. And because we're observing those changes, that means time is moving forward, right? So if time is moving forward for Remy, it must be moving forward for Pasha as well because they're both experiencing the same world, correct? Okay, so then the confusion that people experience when they try to interpret like non-dualistic concepts of the ego and the self and one God experiencing many lives is, how can I be Remy and Pasha at the same time if they're experiencing two different lives simultaneously? And that's what I'm trying to demonstrate here. It's the idea that you aren't both of them at the same time, right? It's like closing one book and opening another book because every point of view is its own story, and we are only one point of view at one time, right? So one point of view at a time. But what we mean here by the word time is that we're only experiencing or observing change from one perspective, right, at a time, meaning that the observation of those changes from that perspective create one particular experience of time. So if I switch from one character to another, I wouldn't do that in the same frame of time, right? So I wouldn't say like, okay, for this half, I'm going to be Remy, and then I'm going to switch to Pasha, but I can only switch to Pasha starting here because up until that point I was Remy. That's not how it works. How it works is that if I'm Remy from here to here, right, in this timeline, then I stop moving as Remy here, and I can go back to the beginning of what it's like to be Pasha, experience Pasha's story up to here, then switch back to Remy and experience the rest of Remy's story if I want to, right? And I'm not saying that we have conscious control over this, at least I don't. Maybe some people claim they do. I'd have a hard time believing them, but anything's possible, right? And we'll probably get to that, like what is possible and do superpowers exist and do I believe in gurus and things like that. We might get to that in another video in the future. But for now, I just wanted to demonstrate the idea that it is possible for a single mind to experience all realities and all lives, even if those experiences appear to exist simultaneously or appear to happen simultaneously because of the relativity of time and how that works, right? It allows us to experience multiple point of views, but you also have to keep in mind that it isn't Remy experiencing Pasha's point of view, right? This goes back to the cup and the self and the ego. It isn't Remy experiencing Pasha's point of view. It's God or whatever you want to call it that's experiencing both Remy and Pasha's point of view, right? It's the non-dualistic side that experiences all the dualistic side's points of view. Now, it's not to say that it's impossible for a dualistic character like Remy or Pasha to experience another character, right? If you use the dream analogy or example, when you dream, you are yourself experiencing another character's story. So I'm not saying that you will never experience any other story but your own. I'm simply saying that when we collect all of the different points of view, they all dissolve back into the non-dualistic point of view. That is the source and the true observer. So it would not be correct to say Remy is God and Remy is experiencing all these different points of view, because Remy is a character, Remy is a cup, Remy is a form, an object that exists within one of the variations or one of the manifestations of the non-dual self. So remember, the non-dual and the dual are equal to each other, but they exist in two different states, just like time and timelessness do. So I think that I've rambled enough, and hopefully it made sense to you, and you'll be able to apply the information to the rest of the model so that the rest of the model makes more sense within the context of this video. And I'll be making a few more videos before I stop and see what you all think and kind of get feedback before I continue making videos and decide what to do next. Thanks for watching.